I own a lot of video games, so you might think I've played most, if not all of them. But, like many other people, I have too many games that go unplayed. With this channel, I aim to slowly but surely change that by reviewing the games in my backlog while making excuses or explanations about why I may not have finished or even played the game. This time I will be reviewing Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze for the Nintendo Switch. I originally bought this game for the Wii U back in 2014. I remember being impressed to see DK in HD for the first time. I also remember enjoying the earlier levels in the game's general creativity. Personally, I love a good 2D platformer, and the Donkey Kong Country series is known for its quality. So why then did I stop playing this game midway through? First, I want to address the differences between the Wii U and Switch versions. There are slight increases in image quality, and the game runs at a smooth 60 frames per second on the Switch. The load times are also noticeably better on the Switch than Wii U, although that should be expected when you compare a game on disc to one that's on cartridge. It's worth noting that load times are still better on the Switch when the game's downloaded too. The most notable change in the Switch port is the addition of a Funky Kong mode, which serves as the game's easier difficulty. Funky gets 5 hearts to start, can do a second jump, can float down for a limited time, allows the player to walk on spikes, and can even breathe underwater indefinitely. Wait a sec, couldn't DK himself do that before? Well yeah, he could. We'll get into why he can no longer do that in just a little bit. That about covers the differences between the two versions. Not a whole lot, to be honest. The Switch makes some slight enhancements, but if you already own the Wii U version, there's not much need to get it on the Switch unless you're really struggling with the difficulty. As with previous entries in the series, Tropical Freeze keeps the story simple but immersive with its fantastic presentation. The game starts off with a bunch of Viking-like animals called the Snowmads attacking Donkey Kong's island and using some sort of mysterious magic to freeze it over. DK and crew get sent flying into the first level, and that's all we're given for the story. I want to reiterate though, the strength of this game's story is in its presentation, not straightforward cutscenes like the opening. Each world a player enters shows a quick preview of what they're in for in regards to the theme and the enemies at the start of the first level. It's a great way to show players what's going on. Now this one here reminds me of Diddy Kong Racing for some reason. That, or something Disney themed. Either way, I like it a lot. But even during the gameplay, players can see a minor story unfolding. A recurring enemy coming back time and time again, things going on in the background, stuff like that goes a long way and really starts to pile up. We don't need to be told what the Snowmads are doing to DK's precious island. We experience it in each level thanks to the incredible presentation. While we're on the topic of presentation, let's talk about how gorgeous this game is. If I'm being honest, there's a good chance that this game could run on a PS3. It's not the power behind the game that's impressive, it's the style. This game's art style will stand the test of time, unlike so many of the photorealistic games that require more power than it. Just look at these shadow silhouette levels. They look great in Donkey Kong Country Returns, and they look great now as well. Whether it's green, luscious environments, deep, dark oceans, or fruit-filled wonderlands, Tropical Freeze has a wide variety of ideas for environments, and Retro Studios has shown with this game just how ambitious they can get. This ambition ties into the fantastic presentation of the game, as players will often find themselves interacting with a dynamic environment of some kind. Things really do get creative, and I can guarantee you'll be experiencing ideas you never thought you'd see in a 2D platformer. Part of the reason this is possible is that Retro Studios didn't let the fact that this is a 2D game stop them from using 3D ideas. There are times in the game where the perspective will change to 3D and players control DK in a 2.5D type space. That is, it's not free roaming like 3D and the controls are still limiting, but there are so many new perspectives to consider as obstacles fly at the player from all directions. The flip side of this is that sometimes Retro Studios got a little too ambitious. There were some 2.5D sections that were a little too difficult for me to judge, leading to my death. There were also times where there was so much going on in the background that I wasn't always sure what to do, once again leading to a death that would leave me scratching my head. These deaths were generally the only ones in the game that felt cheap and not necessarily from my own lack of skill. As for how the game itself plays, Tropical Freeze will bring back fond memories of Donkey Kong Country Returns if you played that. Or if you played any game in the series, really. However, the game takes no issues with shaking up series norms either. For instance, in the first level, within the first minute, players are introduced to the new swimming mechanics of the game. Before, swimming was done Mario style. The player floats down slowly and they have to keep pressing jump to stay up. This was always a simple yet effective way to change things up without drastically changing how the game itself plays. In Tropical Freeze though, players get far more control with how DK swims. You get an attack that makes DK move faster and are able to make precision turns as well. There's a trade-off here though. In order to keep difficulty up in later stages, DK now has a meter for how long he can stay underwater. Players can grab bubbles to regain their air supply, but don't be surprised if you end up reliving your childhood panic attacks from those old Sonic water levels either. Another major change to the series is the inclusion of other characters and how they're used. In Donkey Kong Country Returns, a major change was that players had to play as DK, and getting Diddy Kong meant he got a slow glide with the rocket pack and some extra hits. This trend continues in Tropical Freeze, with new additions like Dixie and Cranky Kong. Diddy has the jetpack from the previous game, while Dixie has her hair twirl, which gives the player a second jump. Cranky Kong is able to bounce the player up and down with his cane, which effectively lets them reach higher areas, while also making them immune to spikes when falling. While the new characters are a welcome addition, I feel Diddy Kong got the worst deal of the bunch. Dixie's double jump feels superior to his gliding. Cranky at least feels different enough that certain levels feel suited to him, but I found myself going with Dixie most of the time when I was given the choice. Like I said, some levels were more suited to Cranky, but I never felt compelled to pick Diddy, which felt wrong to me. Shouldn't DK's best bud be the best of our support characters? Most of the controls will feel similar to other Donkey Kong Country games, but I do feel the thumbstick is not well suited for this particular game. As you can see in the footage, I either wanted to die here, or the downward press was registering as left or right instead. I think you know which. For this reason, I recommend playing with the D-pad, whether it be on the Pro Controller with the Switch, or tablet controller on the Wii U. This is a game which asks you to be precise, and in a split second sometimes too. You'll need the best possible control for a 2D platformer, which, in my opinion, will always be the D-pad. I have some other criticisms of the controls too. As minor as these things may seem, it can add up and become frustrating, or at the very least, something you'll need to get used to. One of these annoyances is how DK grabs things in the game. Players will need to hold down either ZR or ZL to grab a barrel, for example. This may not seem like a big deal for newcomers, but for those of us who have played the older games of the series, it used to be as simple as holding down the run button or pressing up one time. Playing through this game, I could never figure out why they changed that. At no point does it feel necessary to have grabbing things be a completely separate button. In fact, in the platformer genre, it's almost conventional wisdom, thanks to Mario, that holding the run button will let you pick up or grab something. This may be a personal grievance more than a criticism though. I hated having to unlearn what the series had already taught me. I should also mention that grabbing things is a separate button in Donkey Kong Country Returns as well, but I don't remember it bothering me as much back then. My only other criticism of the controls and mechanics is how bouncy Donkey Kong is. In a game that asks you to be precise sometimes, Donkey Kong's bounciness can become infuriating in the more difficult levels. When the player runs into a wall, they bounce back slightly, and sometimes it can lead to a death. I just can't understand why this was needed when in most games the player would stop when colliding with a wall. It makes the player's actions all the more hazardous, and it's a rather unique feature for a game, sure, but I can't seem to think of anything positive about it. It's just kind of annoying. I suppose it's a bit more realistic? But in a game where priority is fun over realism anyway, I didn't see a need for this at all. Other than these minor things, Tropical Freeze is the buttery smooth gameplay that the series is known for. Forgiving collision detection, great jump distances at heights, and a good solid feel to how the player moves will characterize your experience for the most part. In case it wasn't obvious before, Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze can be a tough game. There's a good chance you'll die a lot while playing. The good news is that it's also forgiving. Unlike the tough-as-nails platformers of yesteryear, game overs will be rare and extra lives will be plentiful. There are also items that can be used to save the player from certain death, but I'll go into more detail about that shortly. As I mentioned earlier, levels in this game jump out more than a typical 2D platformer. If you watch closely, you'll also start to see some patterns emerge. Levels tend to focus on a few different themes and testing the players on them. These themes may be mixed and matched in later levels, but rarely do the levels ever feel the same. In fact, they all feel very distinct from one another. This, above all things, is what Tropical Freeze does better than any other game in the entire series. Whereas before, for instance, most minecart levels looked similar, and their biggest differences were difficulty, Tropical Freeze makes them seem entirely different in theme, challenge, and aesthetic. I may not remember every specific detail of every level, but I can always remember the general idea of what a level is upon returning to it. However, I should mention that sometimes this increase in creativity from Retro Studios led to levels that overstayed their welcome. Not to say that there were a lot of these, but there were some levels in the game that I was just begging to end. Sometimes it's because I was dying too much, and other times it was because the length was too long and the pacing was off. It's very much like Sonic 3 actually. There are a lot of great and unique level ideas in that game, but some of the levels go on for what feels like 10 minutes, and these are the ones that took it too far and made me want to quit sometimes. Tropical Freeze has a few of these levels. Now you might think that one of these overly long levels is what ended up sending this game to my backlog back in 2014, but it was actually one of the bosses. Boss battles in Tropical Freeze are another radical departure from previous entries in the series, and really kudos to Retro Studios for changing things up. Rather than the generic 3 to 5 hit to win model that 95% of 2D platformers tend to use, this game makes it a bit more complicated. The bosses each have several phases. These phases still usually require 3 hits to move on to the next phase, but the next phase usually puts a unique spin on things. As you may have already guessed, this step up in complexity leads to boss battles being much longer. Much longer. With some bosses, this isn't so bad. Some of them give you a manageable fight length and difficulty, but others, such as the second boss battle, have long, mandatory phases where the boss cannot be hit, and one mistake can lead to your death. It's battles like this that feel agonizing. This particular boss was the one which made me put the controller down back in 2014. Not only do you need to manage your air supply, you need to be precise in an underwater environment for a long boss battle. However, the second time around I did manage to defeat him. If you find yourself struggling with one of these overly long boss battles or already put Tropical Freeze in your backlog because of them, I'd like to give you some advice which can change the landscape of these battles. Use the items. You'll notice in each world that Funky Kong has set up shop and sells things for banana coins you collect throughout the levels. You can purchase things like extra hearts, invincibility potions, balloons which give the player extra breath underwater, and more. The usefulness of these items isn't just limited to boss battles, but I found them very helpful for the longer ones. Maybe that's what half of them were designed for, even. The one downside here is that if you die with the items equipped, you lose them when you restart, and have to exit the level in order to equip more. There should be an option to re-equip after you die, because it's annoying to have to keep exiting and re-equipping. When you factor in the items, the long boss battles don't seem so bad, but I would say it's the area where Tropical Freeze could use the most improvement. Some of these boss fights aren't fun due to their length. On the flip side, some of them are fantastic thanks to creative ideas, which I'm not going to spoil here. It's about 50-50. Like previous games in the series, there are secret levels which will test the player's skill, without checkpoints too. This makes up the bulk of post-game content if you didn't start the game off going for 100%. It's a fun way to test yourself and see if you can handle everything this already tough game can throw at you. To access these levels, you'll want to obtain the Kong letters in each level of the world that you're in. Some worlds offer alternate paths as well. It's always enticing when you notice a different path out of the corner of your eye in a level. The further you get in this game, the more alternate paths you'll notice. It's always fun to find out how you unlock them, although it can be annoying to miss an alternate path in one of the longer levels. It's not like Super Mario World, for instance, where each level is only a few minutes long, so missing the alternate path is no big deal. And it wouldn't be a proper Donkey Kong Country game without fantastic music, now would it? Retro Studios brought back Dave Wise, composer of the first 2 Donkey Kong Country games for this one, and he doesn't disappoint. He and the other musical geniuses who worked on this game kept the environmental charm intact, while managing to make the music catchy. So often these days, with games being able to handle higher quality music, I've found that the catchiness of a song gets lost in translation, but not here. Although I'm not sure if Dave Wise will ever be able to top the wizardry that occurred in Donkey Kong Country 2's soundtrack, he certainly makes a good case for why he's considered one of the best still in Tropical Freeze. While this is expected of most games, I still wanted to give a mention to the sound effects, which are solid in this game as well. Everything feels good, especially when DK is punching something. I also love the sound of the Viking horn. It feels powerful and immediately grabs your attention. When we think of a 2D platformer, we sometimes think of a genre that's been done to death and has perhaps run out of ideas. Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze puts that myth to rest. There are plenty of ideas and fun gameplay elements that are yet to come, and I hope that with the marvelous effects and presentation of this game, that it will lead the way for others as a shining example. There are times when the game can be frustrating, mostly due to its own great ambitions, but think of it more as a growing pain of a still evolving series. The developers were kind enough to throw some helpful items into the mix to make some of these stumbles less painful, or if you have the Switch version, an entire mode which makes the game easier. As far as this game in your backlog, it's absolutely worth playing, but some aspects can be frustrating. Don't drop everything you're doing just to play it, but if it's in your backlog, make it the next thing you play instead. Thanks for watching my video. It's the first I've ever made, so be sure to let me know how it came out in the comments. If there's anything I can do to improve things, just let me know. See you next time!